So Rahim, we're going to welcome back Marc-Antoine Morin from Manulife. We met with him a year ago as we were talking about the release of the new CAPSA Guidelines. And we've invited him back today because I think it's good to take a look at what went well this past year in helping employers and advisors prepare for the CAPSA Guidelines, but also to take a look at some best practices and learnings from that and where we go from here in 2026. So, from your perspective, what do you hope to see in this episode today?
Yeah, as you said, there a lot of time has passed since we spoken to him. It's been a very long year with lots of information around CAPSA. So I'm excited to see, what Manulife specifically has done. And Marc-Antoine was involved quite a bit with the regulators in building this out. So wanna hear from him, the lessons learned, the challenges, how the industry is thinking about it, what the impacts are to plan members, sponsors, how advisors should be thinking about it. So I'm looking forward to having that chat with him.
Awesome. Right on. Well, let's bring him in. All right. So it's my pleasure to say welcome back to Marc-Antoine. You've been on an episode with Rahim and I in the past, I think pretty much about a year ago. So this is a very timely episode to talk about what's been going on in the past year. And the topic of today's podcast is checking in on the CAPSA Guidelines. So as we kick things off, both of you, Marc-Antoine, Rahim, if you can comment and just level set for our audience, what are the CAPSA Guidelines high level? And then we'll dive into what our episode is today.
Yes. So I would say for our audience who's heard this conversation before, the CAPSA guidelines would be industry best practices on how to govern your group retirement program, right? That would be the easiest way to understand them. They're not rule of law, but they are best practices for plan sponsors, for carriers, for consultants, for plan members to be able to navigate group retirement programs. They've been around for 20 plus years. Marc-Antoine, correct me if I'm wrong. I think they started off in 2004 and they were tweaked here and there, but no major developments or changes to the guidelines until September 2024, where we had, I would say, the largest changes in over 2 decades come to fruition. And since that September date, CAPSA guidelines have gone into effect. And then we have a date in January 1 of 2026, where there are some expectations from the committee on these guidelines, really going into action. So Marc-Antoine, correct me if I'm wrong. If I've missed anything for our audience, feel free to jump in.
I like to, whenever I talk about the CAPSA guideline, I always like to celebrate the fact that the CAPSA guideline are one of the only piece of hair quote here legislation or guidance, I'd say, that's Canada-wide, that doesn't change by provinces. So as much as sometimes regulation is not the best, it can be felt like a constraint. Like in this case, it does bring consistency across the country, which is definitely something we should be happy about.
Yeah, I think that's such an underrated point. It's difficult when you have so many provinces, DC plans that are regulated uniquely in each of the provinces. This is the best, stakeholders could have done to put in something that is relevant across the country. So even though sometimes they're very cumbersome, I think if you look at the spirit behind the CAPSA guidelines, it is really helpful. And there's a lot of good information in there that would help the plan sponsor and the consultant and the carriers do what's best for the plan members, which is making sure, they get to a good retirement outcome. So I forgot about that. That's a great point about, having a blended set of standards across Canada. That's why you're here, Marc-Antoine. You're here to make us better.
When I think about when we first met just over a year ago, we thought in our minds, what are some of the best practices to help plan sponsors, employers implement or adhere to these guidelines as best as possible, and understanding what their obligations are, and for advisors to help those employers walk through implementation. So here we are a year later. We get to compare what we thought were good ideas to what are some actual best practices. So to kick things off, I think I'll just start off by asking, what have you heard and seen from the marketplace, before doing any work at all? How were clients prepared? What have you learned in terms of helping people prepare and how to best support employers?
One thing that was funny in some of the conversations we had with plan sponsors is a lot of people had almost forgotten about the 2004 version of the CAP guideline, because they had been around for 15, 20 years, and people were not thinking of them as the CAPSA guideline. They were thinking of it as like, this is how we manage a plan. So after so many years, people were not thinking about the fact that it's a guideline and it's actually documented and there's a recipe, or almost like a recipe. So if we look at how plan sponsors in general were prepared for the new changes that were introduced in the 2024 version, it's a mix of different things. Because an important fact that about the new guideline is there's a lot of new items that are actually not new. They're just catching up to things that are already happening in the industry. If we're thinking about disclosures or even some governance component, they're not revolutionary. It's the guideline just catching up to the last 20 years of improvement in the industry. So we had a lot of plan sponsors that were already in a good place from a preparedness perspective. In particular, clients that were, or plan sponsors that were, larger or had a pension plan. A pension plan has more guideline and requirements in terms of governance and how to manage the plan. So large employers that had a pension plan were already pretty ready to face the new guideline. One place where there was a little bit less preparedness maybe was a lot of plan sponsors had, I would say, processes, or as I like to joke around, stuff in place, but it wasn't necessarily as documented as it could have been. And the new guidelines are pretty, direct in that respect, is you need to make sure that components of the governance of your plan are documented. So that was maybe a gap for plan sponsors, not in terms of doing things differently, but making sure that your decisions, how frequently you review your processes, that everything is documented. If you go a little bit more down market, as we call it, like in the small to mid-size plan, from a governance perspective there, we've seen a little bit more gap in terms of processes, in particular from a governance standpoint. So preparedness was a little bit, I would say all over the place, but again, it wasn't revolutionary. I like to say if you do a track change of the 2004 version and the 2024 version, it would be just a sea of red because there's a lot of changes. But again, a lot of it was actually catching up to best practices. So that was getting us, prior to the publication of the new guideline. If we're thinking about who actually supported plan sponsors, there was probably two categories of people. Advisors took a lot of space appropriately, supporting their clients in terms of making sure that both the governance of the plan as well as I call it the member experience component of things, are covered. The member experience component tended to be a little bit more delegated to the record keeper. So developing checklists, asking questions, are you doing A, B, C, D, E, F? Please confirm that you're doing that. And then hand-holding plan sponsors a little bit more from a governance compliance perspective, which is where there was a lot of stretch. So these are for plan sponsors that had already a good relationship with an advisor. For those that didn't have that type of relationship in place, we've seen a lot of people relying on the record keeper, or in my experience with Manulife directly. Again, to make sure that the member experience is compliant, but also from a governance standpoint. So for example, here at Manulife, we made sure that our client relation team was extensively trained on the guidelines so that they can almost do the same work as an advisor would do in terms of reviewing the governance process, and we have tools in place and so on.
And Rahim, as we talk about this, I think about the role of an advisor. What an opportunity. I'm sure it was time consuming, but for you to spend time client by client, but walk us through that experience. Did you find being that helping hand, that guiding advisor, as I'm sure you were, how did that change your value add or your relationship with your clients?
I think to Marc Antoine's point, I don't. This is not meant to be a Manulife commercial or a Penmore commercial, but I'll say to you that our practice, as long as I've been here, and even predating myself at Penmore, the practice was built around helping clients manage CAPSA guidelines, right? So whether that is annually reviewing plan information, making sure that education is done, making sure that their roles and responsibility checklists are complete in terms of who remits the money, how do you enroll employees, how do you terminate employees, how you oversee investment options and making sure fees are competitive, etc. But we have to remember, half of the market deals with advisors that may not be well versed on the group retirement side, right? So you may have a benefits advisor who maybe has one or two group retirement clients. They may not have the expertise. So I would say, in my experience, having worked with two prior record keepers before moving to Penmore, there were lots of guardrails in place. So as Marc-Antoine said, you had account managers who were trained to make sure that CAPSA guidelines don't get ignored. And then carriers had their own guardrails around, for example, Manulife has iWatch, and they have certified diversify. They have the Steps Retirement Program, and IA, Manulife, Desjardins, Canada Life have very, very similar tools and guardrails built into their process. So I think most clients were okay. Where I think the danger was and the opportunity is over the last 10 years, there have been a lot of SMB clients, so small, mid-sized business clients that have bought products like Future Step, for example, or other small business products at different carriers, where the advisor kind of owned that client in terms of ongoing checking of processes and making sure CAPSA guidelines are followed, etc. So these new guidelines, I think, re-emphasize the importance of what we've done. So I think the advisor role, the carrier role, very important. And I'll say, Caroline, if you think about the average business in Canada is a small business, right? So let's say you have a company making XYZ, they have 30 people. The plan is administered by an office manager, right? And that office manager is remitting contributions, enrolling employees, meeting with consultants to do the review. And if they don't have their processes documented and they leave that job and a new person comes in, you're starting from scratch, right? So just like we do in our business, where we have business processes around accounting and payroll and sales and finance, CAPSA has to become a function of what that business does. But the function in this case is a group retirement program. So I'm excited that there's a new spotlight. I think things will get better. The question that I had for Marc-Antoine that I'm curious is, what did the record keeper, so what did Manulife have to do in terms of system changes and things like that to ensure that things are all set for Jan 1 2026, if that's the date we're focusing on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can't talk on behalf of the other record keepers, but I think
Of
they'd be
course.
probably in the same boat than Manulife. It wasn't it wasn't that extensive. Again, building on the comment I've made earlier, a lot of the new requirements were just catching up to best practices. So as a result, when we reviewed what's new in the guideline, there was a lot, but when we were checking the boxes of things that we're already doing at Manulife, like most of them were already checked. That said, there were some changes that were required, but I'm going to call them I'm going to call those more like cosmetic changes or almost footprint changes. Are the changes things that will have a material impact on the member experience? No. It's more about making sure that you mention this and that. So, for example, in the enrollment material, there's a few sentences that are being added left and right. Is it going to be life changing for members? No. they'll probably just jump into the enrollment process. But the information needs to be there. Some new educational material had to be developed or adapted. Member booklets, we added member responsibilities, which is a very positive change of the new guideline that members have more, let's say, documented responsibilities in this case. Investment information on the fun fact sheet, a little thing needed to be added. On the member statement, 1 or 2 sentences needed to be changed. So each of them individually were not that sizable. Whenever you touch to the technology, you have to open the beast, make the change, and re-release it and do your testing. So it wasn't a rounding error from an effort perspective, but it wasn't that significant overall from a change perspective. The part that was more significant would be everything that we developed in order to support plan sponsors. And as you were pointing out, Rahim, in some cases, advisors that don't have the expertise from a group retirement perspective. So that was a lot of effort. But the member part or the tech component wasn't that significant, which is good. It means that for the most part, the industry was already where the regulators wanted us to be.
Perfect. And if for those that are listening now, I mean, we're what are we, 6 weeks out before January hits, and I'd like to hear how has Manulife in this example supported that market readiness for employers? If people are sitting there thinking, what resources do I have available? How do I get ready? January's around the corner. What's out there?
So a big component of it was education, providing the right education and the right information to plan sponsors. Again, not everybody had the luxury of having Rahim as their advisor to do a one-on-one meeting to explain the ins and outs of the CAPSA guidelines. So we provided a number of webinars, general education, lengthy guides on what's new about the guidelines. So I know other organizations produced a 1 or 2 pager. We went more the full route approach. I spent a lot of time there, but I think it was a good investment. From a resources perspective, a lot of it was developed from a governance perspective. So for example, an educational document on your role as a plan sponsor in managing a CAP, explaining what it is. Because again, the 2004 guideline, not a lot of people remembered about those. A governance self-assessment checklist, a service provider checklist. So if you deal with a service provider, what you need to do, an investment review checklist, role and responsibilities of various stakeholders in a CAP. We even did a simple code of conduct and conflict of interest policy, because some organizations don't even have one for their businesses. So, and the guideline are sort of suggesting that it could be part of a governance process and a simple governance framework. And the way we build those things, again, because the users of all this material are not going to be people that are serviced by an advisor that knows group retirement, we've made it almost plug and play. For example, my favorite one is, what is the purpose of your plan? So we could have just created a document and say purpose of the plan, just write it there. But we made it almost like a game where you say, well, here's 7 examples of what the purpose of your plan could be. You could just pick the one that fit your purpose. Very plug and play, choices of answer, checkbox, to make it as easy as possible for people that don't necessarily have the expertise or the time to spend on the governance of their plan. But nevertheless, like, this also cannot be just I'm completing document, I'm putting them in a binder, and I'm never going to look at them again. Making sure that throughout that process that we try to make as easy as possible, there is some reality check, and we're raising some important point that as a plan sponsor you should consider.
Yeah, I think building templates for clients and making this as easy as possible is going to be great. And what you're telling us that Manulife is kind of doing on the horizon sounds very, very helpful. Again, I'm not worried about, the larger clients that have a pension committee meeting or they're used to putting processes in place. It's that smaller client that, we've done such a good job of increasing visibility and showing companies the importance of having these group retirement programs as a attraction and retention tools. I would hate for them to be turned off by more guidelines, because if they wanted that, they could have just opened up a pension plan. So I think having some simplicity around it will be very, very helpful. And then Also, Marc-Antoine, I think one of the things that we have to continue to mention is that it's not one size fit all, right? Like there's an expectation from the regulators. Bigger plans have to do more. Smaller plans need to do something, but it doesn't have to be as robust as, $100 million plan. Like, can you expand more on that?
Yes. So when we went through the process, so I was the head of the retirement committee at CLHIA, the recruitment of insurers, as we were going back and forth with the regulators for almost 2 years, reviewing those guidelines, providing feedback. Like that was an important point where there's a materiality component that's written in the guideline, basically saying, well, if you're $1 billion pension plan or group RSP, DPSP, like you should have a stronger governance process than if you're a $1 million plan. So the words that they use is the it can reflect the size of the plan and the size and complexity of the plan as well as the size of the employer. So if you're a smaller employer, the regulators are recognizing that you're not going to be able to apply the same type of governance process, but it doesn't mean that you can get away from it.
Exactly.
We've
Yeah.
tried actually, and the regulators declined more than once. We wanted to say um, the existence of a documented governance framework should depend on the size and complexity of the plan. And they didn't want that. They said, no, you always need to have a form of governance process in place, and it needs to be documented. But the nature, what you put in it, can change based on the size and complexity of the plan. So they had some strong opinion on the fact that it doesn't matter. You always need some sort of governance process in place. We're going to give you flexibility of what it looks like, but you need something, which honestly makes sense. It might lack a little bit of practicality in some case. It might have some downside impact in the adoption of very small employers that are trying to get in that space. But the view of the regulator there, which again, I think might lack a little bit of practicality, is they believe that those plan sponsors should enroll in PRPP and VRSP type of solution. If you want to offer something to your employees, but you don't want to do the governance work, then you should go into those pool solutions that are technically in place in Canada with very little providers, maybe outside Quebec. Quebec has a lot of providers. Governance is unavoidable.
In your example, you said a $1 billion DC plan, even though not required in Ontario, should have a SIP that they govern their plan by, whereas a 50 life group RSP plan doesn't need that. It needs a diversified suite of investment options. You should do oversight on them, but you don't need to go as far as have a statement of investment policy and procedures for something like that. Or maybe $100 million plan should do semi-annual governance reviews, whereas a simpler plan can get away with it once a year, but you still have oversight of it. So I would that be an okay way of kind of understanding that?
Yeah, that's correct. The guideline is not as prescriptive or as helpful as what you just described, but that feels like a very reasonable interpretation of the intent of the guideline. That's a good example.
Okay, and I'm curious, like you've gone through this process, as you said, for a couple of years, and we're on the eve of the Jan 1 date. What would have been some of the challenges and benefits that you've seen from the guidelines?
Let's start with the challenges because they're more fun. There's not a ton of them, to be honest. I think the most significant one, it's a damn if you do, damn if you don't type of, I'd say, feedback regarding the guideline is guidelines are flexible, which is convenient. It gives you, as we just talked about, like the flexibility of saying, well, a small plan, what's a small plan? Well, I'm going to use my discretion and my judgment to determine what's a small plan and what's a big plan in order to determine whether I need an investment policy or not. So that's quite convenient that there's a lot of flexibility. But on the flip side, it means that there's a lot of potential interpretation in the guideline. And we faced that with some advisors and some larger clients, a little bit more sophisticated, where some of them went line by line in the new guideline and basically, I wouldn't say challenge Manulife, but ask questions about some things that are very, very specific. Examples that I can mention here. One large client had interpreted that the new guideline was saying you need to disclose fees in dollars, a little bit like some of the new requirements in the individual retail space where you don't say fees are 1.27%. You do say that, but when you reconcile in the statement, beginning of year, end of year, you have contributions, you have withdrawals, you have return, and fees being expressed as a dollar amount. So that's how they had interpreted the guidelines. We were in a situation because I was at the table with the legislator. I said, no, we've talked to the legislator. That wasn't their intent, but I understand why you might be reading into this. So that did lead to some confusion at times. We had some advisors and clients that went through the guideline and were under the impression that they needed to get involved in the declaration space, or they needed to consider some automatic features like rebalancing. But every word is important in those guidelines. They use the word consider. Doesn't mean that you need to do it. It means you need to ask yourself the question, what's my stance on decumulation? Do I want to get involved or not? Both answers are good. You just need to ask yourself the question. But again, some readers interpreted it like almost like a nudge, or it's something that I should be. So that, I would say, is the biggest challenge that we've seen with the new guideline, getting closer to the actual implementation date. In terms of benefits, there's a ton of them. We've kind of covered a few already in this conversation. I think it's a great opportunity for a lot of plan sponsors to enhance their governance process. I love the example that you provided, Rahim, from a risk management perspective. If the guidelines are not there to nudge you to say, maybe you should have a lot of things documented in case that one special person in the organization leaves, then what? I'm sure they're doing that for the director of finance. They're doing that for the person that's responsible for the shop, but they're not thinking about the pension plan. That's important. So I think it's going to prompt a lot of plan sponsors of various size to re-question a little bit their approach from a governance, from a risk management perspective. So that's very positive. The other part that I think was interesting is because it's new, it has led plan sponsors to review or rethink what they want from a member experience perspective. What do I want from my employees? The new guideline is saying you need to have a communication education strategy in place. That can mean a wide range of things. That can probably or most definitely change depending on the size and complexity of your plan. But it has led those plan sponsors to think about, okay, what is it that I'm actually trying to achieve? What do I want to do? What do I want the member experience to be? So in those more in-depth conversation that we had with some of them, and they kind of came back to us and say, like, here's our 8 findings from a CAP guideline perspective. Quite often, more than half of those had nothing to do with the new guideline. It was more like, hey, we've reviewed the experience and here's some feedback on the steps retirement calculator. Here's some feedback on the website. And then we have to clarify, great feedback. It's not a CAP guideline compliance component, so make sure you don't document that you have a gap. But it's great feedback for us, and we're going to take it, and it's going to be an opportunity for us to improve the member experience. So overall, a lot of positive, like I'm going to call it free consulting from our clients in terms of providing feedback, lots of engagement. So yeah, it's very positive.
Just curious.
As long as we don't do it every year, it's okay.
Yeah, that would be a lot of work. I'm curious, in your conversations with some of the larger clients that you spoke about, or within when you were creating the guidelines with the regulators and bouncing ideas off of them and requirements off of them, where do we stand on cyber? So I know I believe it's guideline 10, the risk management guidelines, there is some language around making sure that you've taken cybersecurity into consideration. And I'm wondering, who is that applicable to? I'm sure you, as a record keeper, are maintaining the data, so you need to have the appropriate security in place to prevent hacks. If the client is downloading certain reporting from your website and keeping it in-house, they need to make sure they have some protections. And in some cases, if the advisor is handling that data, they too take some of that responsibility. So I'm just wondering, how are we supposed to consult our clients to address cyber? Like, is it, hey, buy cyber insurance specific to this? Is it covered as a rider in your overall corporate policy? Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that a little bit.
I'm going to do my best to try to answer this one. It's a complex topic, but I'll start. So guideline number 10 is applicable to pension plan in Canada, and it can be defined contribution, can be defined benefit pension plan. Regulators tend to care a little bit more about defined benefit pension plan, whenever they write those pension plan guideline, but definitely there are some components that are applicable to defined contribution. But to your point, what's the difference between a pension plan or a group RSP or a DPSP? It's notwithstanding some legislative differences, it's the same. You're managing money on behalf of your employees. So I think there's a lot of learnings that we can take from guideline number 10 and say, well, while there's no guideline that say you should do it, it's just reasonable to think that you should address cybersecurity. And that's a component that can be included in your governance framework in terms of risk management. The example that you provided is a really good one, because from a record keeper perspective, I can reassure the audience here that as an insurance company doing business in Canada, the volume of regulations that we have regarding protection of data, cybersecurity standards is, I'm going to use a polite word, is significant and constantly evolving, which is in the best interest of Canadians. But like that part is pretty safe. But whenever that data is going out of our platform back into the employer hands, this is where it can get interesting. Technically speaking, employers are already managing their employees' data through their payroll system. So I think it can lead to an interesting conversation about.
But they may not have, like, they don't need to know beneficiary details or how people are investing. So, and again, I'm sorry I put you in a bad spot. I know you're not a cyber expert per se, but I think it would be great as a takeaway just to get some comments around, what's the general common sense way of adhering to the verbiage in the guidelines around addressing cybersecurity. I know it's something that I have been asked about, and we've talked to pension lawyers who have some comments, but I'd love to hear from the record keepers what their thoughts are around that. Like, should you consider insurance? Should you consider certain way to manage your data, whether it's on the cloud or versus your internal servers? Like, I don't know what that conversation is, but I'm sure our audience, if they ever were to double click on that, would want more information.
So I don't know that we have a view on insurance necessarily, but on the second part that you were addressing, like in terms of prevention, I think we would definitely advocate for prevention from a data perspective. I think there's many ways that you can be successful at managing that risk, whether it's cloud, whether it's local. Like, it might vary depending on the organization. But I think that the most valuable part here is, I think the solution will vary depending on different client sponsors, different organization. But the key point here is asking the question. If you are downloading that data on a regular basis for governance, for reporting, what are you doing with it? Are you just leaving it on your computer? Are you putting it in a LAN? Like, that's part of the risk management questions that you need to ask yourself, because you don't think about that. I just downloaded a report from Manulife. We don't have SIN in our report, but then you have customer ID in there. And the customer ID, combined with other pieces of information, can trigger an account takeover at some point. Well, that's a new risk that you just created in the organization. The employee data is enough to do identity theft, but that's not enough to actually do an account takeover on your record keeper side. Now you're introducing a new risk if you start to download that data. What do you do with it? You should probably treat it the same way you treat your employee data. So these conversations are very valuable, and that's why the governance framework is asking those questions. There's a nice section on risk management. Both Manulife and CLHIA, our little working group, we produced a document that is listing a number of questions that client sponsors should ask themselves, and we were targeting more specifically smaller employers. So without providing what is the one solution, I would say there should be conversations. about
Yeah,
that.
because each company may require its own way of dealing with it. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, fair enough. That's good.
Yeah. So as we wind things up, I think one of the final questions I think about is as we look ahead. First, great to hear the engagement and the thought process that employers are thinking I should do something. What is the best for my employees to engage them and make sure that we're adhering to the guidelines. But what's next after the midnight strikes? New Year's happens. January 1st is upon us. What do you see in terms of employers looking to refine the process when it comes to both governance and I'd say also what are some of those things that you'll watch for that are triggers for future updates?
Unlike Y2K, nothing is going to happen on January 1st, 2026, because practically speaking, the CAP guideline have no teeth. Right? Like there's nobody's going to come, no regulator is going to come audit you on January 2nd. So we do expect, based on the conversations we had with plan sponsors, that some of that some of that compliance with the guideline is going to spill over a little bit into 2026. Like some are all going to be day one compliant, but some of the conversation will or documentation will spill over into 2026. And in all honesty, it's probably not the end of the world as long as the work is being done. Um, I would say a couple of things, a couple of quick thoughts. From a governance perspective, I think one of the danger is that people do the effort of being compliant on January 1st, and then they get into a set it and forget it type of mode. So the spirit of the guideline is that this is an ongoing process. You don't do it once. You need to re-challenge yourself on a regular basis. Actually, you should document when you're going to review the different components of your plan. So we need to make sure we avoid the set it and forget it. And I think advisors like Panmore and Manulife has a role to play in that to remind our respective clients that you need to have an ongoing process. And in terms of the future, I'm going to just pick up my crystal ball here and try to predict when we're going to see the next big transformation. One that feels a little bit like a low-hanging fruit and not that disruptive would be decumulation. So while the new guideline is covering decumulation, like RIF and LIF are part of the CAP plan, even though they're not an accumulation plan, they're part of the plan that are governed by the guideline. But I think as we might see more innovation and maybe more traffic in 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, I think there might be a need to review the guideline and make it more decumulation friendly or more decumulation specific. So that's an area of change there. It could take the form of a separate guideline, or it could be integrated in guideline number 3. But the big transformation, I think, is going to be AI. I think that the member experience over the next, I'm going to say 5 years to be conservative, might be faster than that, is going to get transformed by AI. And I think the biggest challenge for plan sponsors is, while I firmly believe that AI is going to enhance the experience of members, whether it's from a information, education, guidance, or even advice perspective at some point, the role of the plan sponsor and the role of advisors is going to get more complex. Because how do you do governance on an AI model? You can do governance on a step talent calculator, you can review the educational material, but how do you do governance on something that's air quote thinking? So I think the accumulation to some extent, but AI to a larger extent, might actually be one of the biggest upcoming transformation that could shake guideline number 3 or could trigger the need to have a separate guideline on the use of artificial intelligence in CAP plan, something like that. That's what my crystal ball is telling me right now.
I like the Y2K reference. It really dates us here. That's so funny. Yeah. So as we wind up, I think I'll just ask Rahim any insights you'd have from the advisor standpoint, advice you'd have for both advisors who are listening, record keepers, as well as employers as we wrap up this episode.
Yeah, I think the guidelines are here. I think we take a positive approach. They're meant for the overall good. They're meant for these plans to run properly, so plan members have the best chance of meeting their retirement goals. And I think for those advisors who are who don't have a group retirement practice, let's say, there are going to be tools offered by carriers that are going to be very helpful. That's what I would say. I would say to clients that, as Marc-Antoine said, just because things are not completed on Jan 1, it's nothing to panic about, but it is something that's going to be helpful for you once you have the process in place. And it's not like a target date fund. It's not set it and forget it. It's constantly evolving as your business evolves and your members evolve and your plan evolves. So overall, it is an added layer. Yes, it does bring in extra work, but at the end of the day, it's going to make your plan stronger from a governance perspective. So, I think we should take this as a positive, and I hope it doesn't turn those plan sponsors away who are thinking about having a retirement program, but now are like, what, we'll just give you a cash T4 income in lieu of this because we don't have the manpower to manage CAPSA along with our day to day. I hope that's not the case. I hope we evolve and let this be something that strengthens our industry instead of having a rift.
Great. Any final comments, Marc-Antoine?
No, I mean, it was once again a pleasure to participate in the podcast. It's always a very interesting conversation. And I don't know if I'll still be around in 15, 20 years. Like my retirement plan is telling me that I should be retiring in 20 years. So maybe I'll be there for the next version of the guideline. Who knows? But we'll see.
Good. Well, all of us have great advisors that help us retire when we want to retire, don't we? So that's great to hear. Good. Well, thank you so much for being on our episode of the Benefits Alliance Voice today, Marc-Antoine, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been the Benefits Alliance Voice. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network and be sure to check out the podcast notes for any additional materials.